Okay, it is 1 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome to the webinar today. My name is Carrie Berger and I'm the coordinator for the Northwest Fire Science Consortium. For those of you not familiar with the consortium, we are one of 15 fire science exchange networks that are funded by the Joint Fire Science Program. In 2018, over 12,000 fire science delivery activities were completed by the exchange network, and that includes workshops, field trips, research briefs, multimedia productions, and there were more than 400,000 participants, so that's pretty great. To learn more about the Northwest Fire Science Consortium and the Exchange Network, visit our webpage at northwestfirescience.org. To avoid any noise interference, I have muted your audio, so if you have a question, please type it into the chat box. Also, I will be recording the webinar and will archive it on our website and YouTube channels. You can find both those web addresses in the chat window. So it is my pleasure to introduce Amanda Rao, formerly known as Amanda Stamper. Amanda started her career in fire management as a member of a 20-person contract crew in 1999. In 2001, after finishing her bachelor's in philosophy at the University of Oregon, she returned to fire management, working on hotshot crews, hand crews, and engines as a fuels technician on the Deschutes National Forest, an assistant fire management officer in fuels management on the Ochoco National Forest and Crooked River National Grassland. She studied natural resources at Oregon State University and completed a master's in natural resources, fire ecology, and management at the University of Idaho in 2012. She has since worked for the Prineville Bureau of Land Management as a natural resource specialist, coordinating post-fire emergency stabilization and rehabilitation, as invasives program manager for the Deschutes and Ochoco National Forest and Crooked River National Grassland, fire management officer for the Nature Conservancy in Oregon and Washington, and the chair of the Oregon Prescribed Fire Council. Wow. Thank you so much, Amanda, for being here with us today. Whenever you're ready, go right ahead.
Thank you, Carrie. Am I coming in clearly?
You sure are.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share some of my experiences with fire management challenges and opportunities in a rapidly changing climate. This talk is focused partially on those environmental conditions and climatic conditions that have contributed to challenges and opportunities, as well as some of the work and partnerships that the Nature Conservancy and other partners across the Northwest have engaged in to capitalize on some of those circumstances. With that, I'm going to get started. Once my computer cooperates here. Okay. Sorry, my slides are not advancing as I'd hoped they would, so I need to make sure that's working. There we go. All right. So the concept I like to start off with is one in which you look at a situation that's attempting to explain a complex condition and realize that it is too overwhelming to really process in one single image. So that is that the ecosystems that we're dealing with are not only more complex than we think, but they're more complex than we can think. Hence the title of this presentation, Expect the Unexpected. So really the optimal approach is to look at these circumstances as ones that are going to continually surprise us and to try to keep up if we can and anticipate opportunities in these rapidly changing conditions. So what this shows is a surface spread equation as you would try to apply it to a situation like what the ecosystem is doing when you're looking at precipitation and photosynthesis, respiration of plants. And it really gets quite overwhelming quickly. So not that I'm going to attempt to simplify this too much, but I'll start with the simplest thing that we use to describe fire, which is the fire triangle. So we try to simplify these things so that we can think our way through them. And in this case, we're going, okay, we've got three things that fire needs: heat, oxygen, and fuel. Well, when you look at how the fire behavior triangle, which is building off of the fire triangle, starts to interact with climate, we see how much more complex these situations become. As we get wet, stormy winters, which we've just recently had here, especially in Western Oregon, we see that we end up with higher fine fuel loading. We have increased dead fuel loading, so that contributes to the fuel side of the triangle. When our summers become hot and dry, the wind speeds are higher. We actually have more lightning, up to 12% more lightning as the climate warms with each degree of climate or each degree of temperature change. Our snow melt is earlier, and this all contributes to hotter fires and drier fuels. The only part of this triangle that doesn't really change too much is the topography side, so we always consider that the more constant. The fuel side is what we have control over, and that's what I'm going to talk about the most in this talk. And then the weather side, we have some indirect control over through our influence on climate change. But that's a lot harder for us to influence than the fuels part of this triangle. So I've attempted to sort of identify which fuel conditions are affected by climate change, and it turns out pretty much all of them are. You might even be able to put an arrow to chemical content, but I haven't been able to establish that very concretely. So looking at compactness, for example, when you have a lot of snow, you can end up actually having more compact fuels that are slightly less available to burn. Loadings can be increased, whether that's through precipitation received later in the year, in the spring, in March, for example, as we've recently received. You end up with higher fine fuel loadings, but we also had an ice storm here in Western Oregon a few years ago that resulted in a lot of other size classes of fuels being increased in their loading up in the 10 and even 100 hours range. You also see changes in horizontal continuity, that being the grass crop, basically, right? So more of that fine fuel loading can be affected by climate change. The size and the shape, I kind of spoke to that with regards to the loading. And of course, the moisture content, probably being the most significant fuel condition affected by climate change, and how fuels not only gain and lose moisture, but how quickly that occurs. So I'm going to see if this will actually play. We'll give it a second. If it doesn't, oh, there it goes. So I think this is a really interesting graphic showing temperature change from 1850 to 2016. It just kind of shows how quickly things begin to change as you get into the 2000s. And so that's really telling in terms of how quickly things are changing in the environment. So we know that wildfires are increasing, and we know that the season is getting longer. If we just look at from the time of 1980 through 2012, we see about 100, 110 more fires on average per year, larger than 1,000 acres. We also see that since the 1970s, we have an increase in the average length of wildfire season by about 2 months. Now, the question is that really an increase in the longer scheme of things, or is that just a recent increase? And we can see that from research from McKenzie and Little, that we did have a warmer and drier climate the beginning of the last century, and we had a lot more hectares burned during that time. So because of the cool, wet climate and combined with active fire suppression during the middle of the last century, we saw a very marked decrease in hectares burned, and now we're seeing an increase. So some of that may be due to natural, and we know it's partially due to natural climatic variations. So then the question is, to what extent are we exacerbating those or contributing? That's not really the point of my talk today, so I'm not going to get into how much human activity is contributing to the warm, dry climate period that we're dealing with now. I just want to talk about what that means for fire managers, whether you're fighting a fire or lighting fires. So I'm going to start off talking about 2017. This talk was actually originally developed for a presentation to the Western Forestry Graduate Student Symposium, and I was asked to present it to this group. I've changed it quite a bit because there was some time between then and now, but I'm going to start with what I presented to that group. And We're going to start by looking at this map of the Oregon wildfires in 2017, which were substantial, in particular because of the proportion of wildfires that occurred on the west side of the Cascades. And you could see that line going down the Pacific Crest Trail is essentially the dividing line, more or less, between the east and west side of the Cascades. And we just had a ton of fires on the west side of the Cascades. Not only is that unusual in general, it was the last thing that anyone expected last year, and I'm going to explain why. So here we see on March 31st, 2017, the snow water equivalent across Oregon was high. There was only a few places in the state that were below 100% of their normal, and this is the median established from data collected between 1981 and 2010. That negative 997 is a mistake or an anomaly of some kind. But otherwise, everything was pretty well above normal, especially on the west side of the Cascades, where you see that 140 number. Sorry, just jumped ahead there. We had lower than average temperatures for most of the Pacific Northwest from October 2016 through March 2017, and it was quite a bit wetter than typical for the West Coast, especially Southwest Oregon, California, and the Great Basin. Here we have a picture of Crater Lake Lodge at 137% of its average. This was in April, and it still had 117 inches of snow. So we were thinking, well, this isn't going to be much of a fire season. June and July were not showing any significant wildland fire potential from Predictive Services. This was issued April 1st, and so most fire managers were not anticipating we were going to have much of a fire season. Well, by the time we were into even, early July, we were starting to max out, or we were at least approaching above average, and we were maxed out by August as far as indices for energy release component. Now this represents all 73 key RAWS stations in the Pacific Northwest, so this was an average of all of those. And we actually set records that year in August, the last thing that was expected in 2017. The Trout Creek RAWS is up on the Willamette National Forest. This was used for the Jones Fire up in Fall Creek. And we can see that at the beginning of the season, we had record high 1,000-hour fuel moistures. 1,000-hour fuel moistures are a key input to energy release component. So we had the highest ever recorded, and by early August we had the lowest ever recorded. Now this was in one season, pretty remarkable. Here we show for Trout Creek, the ERC, the energy release component, was again setting records by early August, and it was starting out at none, 0. Like lower than it ever, well, the lowest ever recorded. Similarly, for the east side of the Cascades, either at the lowest end or below low, and ending up setting records again by early August. So, of course, Predictive Services had revised their wildland fire potential outlook significantly by September, having all of this updated information and rapidly changing conditions. And so the question is, well, what happened here? How did we go from a cool, wet winter and not really any significant predicted wildland fire potential to this? Well, what we know is that climate change is driving temperatures up, and it's increasing wildfire risk. The average annual temperature in the western United States has increased by almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit since 1970. And that means that our winter snowpacks are melting up to 4 weeks earlier than they used to. So all that snow, those 137%, 140, did not have a chance to have an effect on the fuels that would, or even if they did melt slow enough, were offset by the temperatures. And so we are basically not getting enough moisture to offset the temperature increases. And what that means is that our forests are drier for longer periods of time, and the conditions are primed for wildfires to ignite and spread. Despite that, efforts to conduct controlled burning and prescribed fire ensued, and we managed to get quite a bit done with the Nature Conservancy's program. We partner a lot with the Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and other entities to implement prescribed fire. So we got about 4,427 acres burned, of which we led 1,830. There were 2,500 acres of assists. We conducted 2 training exchange events, which I'll talk more about in a little bit. And we hosted researchers for live fire data collection and research at our Sycan Marsh Preserve. So we had a pretty successful year. We would have burned more if it hadn't been for the fire season, and particularly in the rivers to ridges geography. That's in the South Willamette Valley, Eugene Springfield area, where prescribed burning has been conducted since the 1980s. These numbers are small for many people who are doing larger landscape burns, but for the threatened and endangered species dependent on fire in the South Willamette Valley and throughout the Willamette Valley for that matter, these little acres really do count. And we did manage to get 306 acres burned, but we had about 1,000 planned, and we delayed our burning by at least 3 weeks because of the smoke impacts and the desire to not put more smoke in the air on top of the smoke that everyone was experiencing from wildfires. U.S. Forest Service also did a fair amount of burning, but you can see their numbers were down as well. So where they might normally burn, you know, they were down not quite 6,000 acres there in 2017. But really looking at the need, the map on the left shows the disturbance restoration needs on forested lands managed by primarily U.S. Forest Service across both Oregon and Washington. And there's about 4.2 million acres that need fire, of the right kind, of course. So right now there's about 1.4 million acres currently planned on these, and these are fire-adapted landscapes, so they exclude the west side of the Cascades, but include southwest Oregon, which is more akin to the fire-adapted forests of eastern Oregon and eastern Washington. So you can see there's impacts to the programs, even though in theory that would have been a really good year for burning, but the combination of the rapid drying and the smoke impacts and air quality issues really curtailed capitalizing on what might have otherwise been a really good window for burning. So now we're going to move into 2018. This is the map of the fire perimeters. These are large fires, so we're not including small fires here. And it's quite a different story. There's a fair amount of activity in southwest Oregon, and then there were some significant fires up in the north central part of the state, east of the Mount Hood National Forest, adjacent to the Warm Springs Reservation. And these were largely grass fire-driven events. They're in canyon lands of the John Day and Deschutes River Canyons, and then a few other fires scattered throughout the state, but nothing compared to 2017. Well, when we look at what was predicted and what was verified, so we have a verification of the temperature predictions for May here, it was kind of on the fence as to whether or not it was going to be warmer, and they actually were a fair bit warmer than predicted. We also had predicted below average precipitation, and that is what panned out, so the prediction was correct on that. But we know it was very dry, and here we've got the snow tail, the same measurements that we had from 2017 showing everything above 100. We've got places that are literally 0% of snow water equivalent. I mean, that is just incredibly dry. Nowhere in the state was anywhere near normal. Everything was basically below 50% as of May 30th, and by that time you're not expecting any improvement. So we really had poor snowpack. Our drought monitor showed that by May 31st we had abnormally dry conditions, severe drought developing in the eastern part of the state. So Oregon really being quite dry and not expected through the summer to improve, expected to be warmer than normal and drier than normal. So of course that led to wildland fire potential outlooks indicating that we were going to have a bad fire season. Here we have July, August, September. It was all supposed to be really bad, but it didn't really turn out to be that bad. And it sort of follows that, as I tell people when they ask me, are we going to have a bad fire season? I always say, it depends on the ignitions. If we don't get the ignitions, we don't really necessarily see the fires, even if the conditions are primed for large fire growth. So this is showing by the later part of October, the 100-hour fuel moistures, they're pretty dry. I mean, they're down in the 6 to 10% range for most of the state. A few places they're up around 11 to 15, but 6 to 10, which is pretty dry for 100-hour fuels. Similarly, for 1,000-hour fuels, most of the state was in that range of 11 to 15%, 16 to 20 in some places, and then up in the northwest part of Oregon, where we'd expect it, they're up above 30. That was partially due to some precipitation and storms that moved into the northwest part of the state but didn't really make it down to the south end. So here we ended up with a really good burn season. Now, this is in a year when it was really dry. We had all these drought conditions, but we had a really late burn season. So we were able to continue burning all the way through the end of October. We burned 5,302 acres of TNC lead and assists all across the state. A lot of those were on the Fremont-Wainema National Forest and the Sican Marsh Preserve, where we have a partnership with cross-boundary burning there. So really a successful year overall for a prescribed fire. And here, to use this Rivers to Ridges example again, we broke records last year. We burned over 700 acres. That's the most that's ever been burned in one season in that geography in the South Willamette Valley. And so then my question is, I don't think we can do that kind of burning without our partnerships, and I'm going to talk about that next. But if we look at climate change as an opportunity and we partner, can we get more burning done? Because I'm always trying to see the silver lining in this stuff, and I want to believe that there's opportunity in some of the danger here with climate change. So I do think that as we get move into a time when there's more threats, there's also more opportunities. I listed some of the partnerships with Rural Fire Protection Associations, the Rivers to Ridges Partnership, South Central Oregon Fire Management Partnership, as well as the Klamath Lake Forest Health Partnership, are really spearheading some amazing work with cross-boundary work and burning. The Deschutes Collaborative, and Ashland Forest Resiliency, and then the Willamette Valley Prescribed Fire Partnership, which is a valley-wide partnership including Rivers to Ridges. I list the ones that we're actively engaging in with operations, but TNC has a lot of other engagement with partnerships where we do more science and research and assistance through collaboration. So what's going to happen in 2019? Of course, we don't have any fires going on here. There's a few pile burns going on, but no wildfires yet. And as many of you I'm sure know, or maybe still experiencing, we've just had some pretty interesting weather here, some late season wintry weather. And what we're seeing right now is that the temperatures actually observed in February have been a little bit below normal. And we've got precipitation that was kind of on the edge there. Some of it was predicted to be below normal. Some of it was predicted to be about equal. So the variation there is seen. But some areas got way more precipitation than normal. And here we've got our snow tell. So here's a big change. We went from everything being below normal. A few places were close, or actually East Oregon had 101 there on their snow tell. But by March 4th, everything's pretty much above normal or close to it. Some places as high as 160% of normal snowpack. So we've got some recovery there, but we don't really know what that means as far as our fire season based on what we learned from 2017, right? The drought monitor still, as of February 28th, shows that we are in a severe drought in much of the state. Moderate to severe drought or abnormally dry. Very little of the state is excluded from that. So we'll see what happens when they come out with the next outlook for in April, accounting for some of the impacts of the recent weather going into March. They don't have anything updated right now for February, but they will have something coming out again here in March. The outlook shows that we're going to have persistent drought in the central part of the state, central and northern part of the state. Some of it's predicted to remain but improved, and then some of it's predicted to be removed, but not very much of it. So drought really is going to be continuing, but hopefully will be improving, especially with this recent weather that we've received. for the monthly temp and precipitation outlook, it's supposed to be below normal temperatures. Oh, sorry. I have to go back. Below normal temperatures for March. And then no strong signal really for the Pacific Northwest as far as precipitation goes. We do have an El Nino advisory, so that means sea surface temperatures are going to be above average or predicted to be. That winds and cloud convection are going to be consistent with that pattern, and that those conditions are expected to continue through the spring of 2019. And we see that through June, we're expecting to have above average temperatures and below average precipitation. So that means that maybe some of this winter weather that we've experienced is not actually going to have that much of an impact on our fire season. But as to what that means is really unclear, as we can see that we had a fire season that was predicted in 2018 to be significant, and it didn't really pan out. We had a fire season in 2017 that was not predicted to be significant that was. And that's why I titled this talk, Expect the Unexpected, and point to the uncertainty factors and the difficulty of understanding the complexities of the situation at hand. So here you see June 2019 so far, no significant wildland fire potential outlook, but the accuracy of that prediction will improve as we get closer to June. So I'm going to switch over to talking about impediments to prescribed fire, what kind of activity is happening in other states, but really relative to the Northwest, and how some of these past few years are affecting the metrics we're seeing here. I'm going to start in the top left corner. In 2017, this was all prescribed fire activities by state. Oregon, Washington, and California were pretty much all commensurate with one another in that 500,000 to 200,000 acre range, and that's including both agricultural and forestry burning. But when we look down at prescribed fire acres trending, Oregon's down. This doesn't look good compared to the last report that came out, which, by the way, this report is from the Coalition of Prescribed Fire Councils, who team up with the National Association of State Foresters and do a survey of fire use. So they call it a fire use report. They put it out every few years, and it's a really useful document for understanding what's going on across the country and in our state. So the last report that came out showed that our acres were trending up. But this was 2017. That wasn't a very good year for burning, even though it seemed like it could have been. And so we actually have our acres trending down. I still include the other graphic to the lower right-hand corner. It makes Oregon look really good. But this was 2010 to 2015, and showing the leadership of our state in the West in controlled burns acres completed. But what are the impediments to prescribed fire use nationally, and what's going on there? So we see that the majority of the impediments are related to weather. I always like to say, if I could have one superpower, it would be to control the weather so I could get more burning done. And that would take care of 44% of the problem, right? Well, can't do anything about that, so I just sort of leave that one out. I suppose we could do something about it, but that would be related to larger efforts around climate change. So then we go down to liability and insurance. Now, that seems like mostly a private landowner issue, but it actually, when you share liability, apart from the insurance side, if you're looking at agencies, interagency, interorganizational efforts, when you share liability, develop agreements, and work together, you lessen the impact of that impediment. And so I would argue we have control over that, especially when we choose to enter into partnerships. The next most significant impediment, representing 10% of the problem, is capacity. And that's actually related to resources, so you can kind of lump those together. That your capacity and your resources are linked. And so when you can increase capacity and get more resources, you can get more burning done. And that's also related to partnerships, which is why I'm going to spend a lot of time on that here today. The remaining issues are permitting and legal requirements. So whether that's the cost of getting a permit to burn, having difficulty getting approval to get a permit to burn, those sorts of things, those are significant, and each state is different. Oregon's pretty good for the most part when it comes to how we manage the permitting side for smoke management, and it's actually gotten a lot better with the recent revisions to Oregon Smoke Management Plan. But it's still a big concern, especially for those who are working outside of the federal and state governments, because there's more of a legal burden to bear. Air quality and smoke management is 4%. That seems lower than I would expect, actually, but again, it depends on which state you're in. If you're in California or Washington, it's more difficult to get an air quality permit versus Oregon. It's actually a little easier. Public perception, another thing we have control over through education and outreach. I think the prioritization really has to do with burns that didn't rise to the top, and then we have a couple others with WUI and population growth, and that really relates back to public perception as well. So what are we going to do about these impediments? Well, a colleague of mine challenged me to create a graphic explaining how these different networks that are attempting to overcome these impediments work within one another and stack on top of each other or nest within one another. And so if you start with the core, it's really through the tribes, regional fire management partnerships, and collaboratives. They all can work within and be part of the prescribed fire councils, which I'll also talk a little bit about. And then that fits into a larger network, whether that's TREX, which is a national and international program, which I'll explain here in a minute. Another example here being the Pacific Northwest Cooperative Burning, with Oregon and Washington really working closely together, exchanging resources across our state boundaries, that being really facilitated by the fact that we are a Forest Service region as well as Fish and Wildlife Service region. And then the Coalition of Prescribed Fire Councils and the National and International Prescribed Fire Community. So working within these different networks to integrate spreads like fire, like good fire, the kind we want on the ground. Prescribed Fire Councils, this here shows them starting in 1989. They actually started in the 70s, but they didn't really pick up speed for quite some time. So this really just shows how when the Coalition of Prescribed Fire Councils was formed in 2002, that they just started growing and taking off. And but they were originally started in 1975 in Florida, and it was to alleviate the liability burden on landowners and to uphold the right to burn. Here you can see in across the United States, most states have a prescribed fire council. There's a number of them that do not. And there have been states that were developing them, and there may be green states developing in the future, but as of right now, most of the West Coast is covered, most of the South is covered, and it's really Northern Rockies, parts of the Northern Great Plains, Nevada, and or not Nevada, but Utah, who don't have councils yet. And that's all up to them to decide they want to develop one. So the missions of the councils here in Oregon and Washington are fairly similar. It's to either serve as a venue for practitioners, state and federal agencies, academic institutions, tribes, etc., all the different interested parties to come together to collaboratively promote, protect, conserve, and restore the responsible use of fire as a land and resource management tool. In Washington, it's a little more concise to protect, conserve, and expand the safe and responsible use of fire, particularly prescribed fire, which Oregon has intentionally made it just fire in general to support so-called natural ignitions and using fire that isn't prescribed. But in both cases, it's really a diverse effort from a lot of different parties, including those who regulate and maybe prevent some of the fire that we want to see on the ground. But you've got to talk to those people and involve them. So now I'm going to move into talking about some of the partnerships and the collaboratives. Southern Oregon Forest Restoration Collaborative and the Ashland Forest Resiliency Project has been around for about 10 years now, particularly the AFR piece. And they have really done a huge amount of work to build the social license to do treatments in the Ashland watershed and throughout the Rogue Basin. So they've just been continually expanding that geography from AFR to the entire Rogue Basin, and they now have a Rogue Basin strategy to treat various landscapes in that geography. South Central Fire Management Partnership, I talked about that, as well as Klamath Lake Forest Health Partnership. Really innovative group of folks, lots of different agencies and entities involved, working on private lands, state-sponsored work on private lands through the Good Neighbor Authority and state and private forestry. And a lot of work being done there. The Oregon Prescribed Fire Council annual meeting is going to be in Lakeview this year in early June, June 4th and 5th. I encourage folks to come because of the work they're doing there and to get to tour some of their projects. Eastside Restoration Strategy and the Blue Mountain Forest Partnership is another fabulous example. They've really had a lot of success with the Forest Service concentrating a lot of their funding and attention there. And they've done some very large acreage burns over the past few years and really showing a lot of just innovation in terms of how they're approaching getting their work done. Central Oregon Fire Management Services and the Deschutes and Ochoco collaboratives have been around for quite some time. They're really just blue ribbon as far as leading the pack and have been leading the region in terms of acres completed of their targets for quite some time. It's a place that I was lucky enough to get to work for a number of years and really cut my teeth in learning how to burn. And that's where one of our training exchanges is hosted, in addition to one in Ashland, for that reason, to show people how to get this kind of work done efficiently and push boundaries and take risks and to get more burning done. Willamette Valley Prescribed Fire Partnership is a more loosely organized group that works across the Willamette Valley in a very short time frame in the fall, all the way from Eugene, Springfield up to the Salem area. Fish and Wildlife Service is a leader in that effort, as well as the Bureau of Land Management and the Nature Conservancy. So now I want to make sure I have time for questions. So I'm going to move into the Prescribed Fire Training Exchange and what that looks like. So this is another triangle, because that's what we do in fire, is we like triangles and as a way to explain things. So in the TREX triangle, we have training, treatments, and outreach. The idea here is that we need to help work through bottlenecks with the workforce in prescribed fire. We need to help educate the public and do good outreach to tell the story, and we need to get those good burns done. And one of the reasons I'm bringing up TREX in this presentation is because we pre-identify timeframes for these events. So we've already got Ashland in Central Oregon, and as well as Cascadia up in Washington and in Clay Elum scheduled. And, you know, most people who do prescribed burning don't schedule their windows months in advance because they know better. If you do that, you're not going to get your burn window, right? So you wait till the burn window appears and then you mobilize to go get the work done. But you can't get, 40 or 50 people assembled from all across the globe to learn and burn together on a moment's notice. So we take that risk in the program, and what that means is that we oftentimes burn under conditions that others might not, because they don't think it's going to burn well. And I just can't tell you how many times I've been surprised. So that again gets back to the title of Expect the Unexpected. Maybe give it a try, drop a match and see what happens. And if it burns well and if those conditions aren't ones you would expect, then go back to your burn plan, go back to the drawing board and look at what the conditions were like, what was happening in the environment, and you might be surprised by what you find. So this program is now 10 years old. It started in 2008. And the reasons that this program was really developed is to build local capacity for safer fire, to help communities become more fire adapted, to bring together diverse crews to cross-pollinate and help one another learn from each other, to give participants hands-on experience with both ecologically and culturally appropriate fire, to support and promote interagency cooperation, integrate traditional burning, and work through bottlenecks in the prescribed fire workforce, and as well as barriers to burning. I think that last one is significant because, when I first got started, Carrie mentioned I started in 1999, I was sort of on the tail end of a time when folks burned a lot more for brush disposal and slash hazard removal. And so I met people who had burned these big clear cuts up in the woods and gotten to see some really ripping fire. And there's been sort of a lull, and that's partly because of changes in forestry and timber management, and not so much of that kind of burning, and a shift over to programs where the idea is to reintroduce fire as a more ecological process rather than say, site prep for planting trees. So we need something to replace that, because those were driven by revenue and targets that were associated with collection of funds from timber sales. So now we've got a more subsidized program, and so we need ways to find ways to get people experience so that they can get qualifications and learn how to burn. So what is the Fire Learning Network? It is supported through the Promoting Ecosystem Resilience and Fire Adapted Communities Together, which is also known as PERFACT. That is funded under a cooperative agreement between the Nature Conservancy, the Forest Service, and agencies of the Department of Interior. So they all throw into that pot, and then that helps support TREX. And those TREXs are covered under a master participating agreement between the Forest Service and the Nature Conservancy. And the ultimate goal is to help us all learn to live with fire and learn how to use fire more appropriately. So you can see the tenets there of fire adapted communities, as well as social and operational capacity for right fire, restoring and sustaining these resilient landscapes. And that also has a tie to science learning and cultural knowledge. The TREX program has been on an upward trend since it began. It was the first, I guess you could say it's the first time it flatlined, when somehow we managed to have exactly the same number of participants in 17 and 18 at 569. There was a little bit of a decrease in acreage in 2018. Some of that just related to weather conditions, and in some cases it being too dry when the events were scheduled. So it can work both ways, where you schedule an event and then it's too dry to burn and you have to find other ways to train, or you can schedule an event and you might think it's a little too wet to burn, and then you burn anyways and it does a lot better than you think. But the key is that unless it looks like it's really out for the whole time, everybody assembles anyways. So this is looking at where these TREX events are hosted. The Cascadia TREX, as I said, is up in Cle Elum, and they're going to have their third TREX event this spring. The application period is open for that right now. And then we have Central Oregon and Ashland, and those events are going to be hosted this spring. Central Oregon, I think, is their 5th event, and Ashland is having its 4th event. Now, I want to speak a little bit to the Yurok TREX, because that's one there that is identified that I think is significant, and I'm going to talk about that in this slide. So last February, not this year, but the year before, they decided to plan an event. And they said, hey, we're going to do this TREX and we need your help. And I said, okay, I'd love to come help. I've always wanted to learn how to burn with your tribe. They do really sophisticated targeted applications of fire for cultural plants, for their foods, and for their medicines, a myriad of purposes. And when they said they wanted to do it in February, I thought, okay, we'll see what happens. I'm not real sure that's realistic, but okay, I'm willing to give it a try. And of course, I scheduled a vacation to the Yucatan like the week before their training was planned, thinking it would probably get canceled. And it didn't. It turned out that they nailed it, and there was a window in February. And so I traveled down there, and we burned, and it went really well. And so what that's led me to realize is that looking to tribal communities and indigenous people to lead us on this stuff is really important, because their histories of using fire are a lot more deep than those who are non-tribal and non-indigenous, who are coming onto the scene more recently. We're dealing with a time frame that's basically from the fire suppression era to now, and that's our sort of our frame of reference with fire management. And most of that time we've spent putting fires out, and we really haven't necessarily been prompted to explore these windows. So on the bottom I show this global temperature change for between 1900 and 2000. And you see that the 2 months where the most significant changes occurred is in January and February in terms of the increase. And so what that means is that we need to look at times of the year when we normally would not look to burn. Now you've got a lot of considerations with regards to plant phenology, moisture content, dormancy, lots of things that you need to think about. But the fact that they said, let's give it a try in February, and that worked out, is significant. This year we did the same thing, but if we'd only scheduled it a week earlier, we would have hit our window. Now we're kind of waiting for the weather to dry out to try and get started down there again. So I urge you all to think about that, really, in terms of seasonality more than anything. That's something that I think we're missing and that we need to be mobilized for. The biggest challenge with that is the way in which our employees are generally handled in terms of when they work. So folks get done with fire season, they're done with pile burning, they hang up their line gear, they go do winter work, sharpening chainsaws or doing office work, and all of a sudden windows appear in the middle of the winter, and none of us are really ready for it. So we might need to start thinking about how we can prepare ourselves to capitalize on times of the year that have been traditionally not considered for application of fire. And as I conclude here, before we make some time for some questions, I just wanted to make a point about how wildfire suppression impacts us versus prescribed fire. And these are just two of the metrics that we could use, cost in both dollar signs and human life. We go out there and we chase a lot of fire around, and we're in an increasingly more dangerous environment with more and more uncertainty. Paradise being a really good example, and the campfire that occurred there, and that, we've got a lot of people losing their lives going after this stuff and chasing these fires. And when we burn, we don't typically have that happen. So as you can see in my slides, since 1910, we've lost well over 1,100 people in fire suppression actions, and we've had 6 people die doing prescribed burning. And that's all including things like heart attacks and stuff that might be sort of compounded. But and then just the cost per acre is like night and day. I mean, a very expensive prescribed burn might approach the cost of a wildfire, but typically, $400 is a pretty expensive prescribed burn. And the more you partner, the more you come together with others and share the risk, the liability, resources, and costs, the more your per acre cost goes down. And when people ask me how much my prescribed burns cost, it's hard for me to actually tell them, because we have so many people that we assemble collectively whom I don't pay for, whether it's because we're sharing the burden and their employees are just coming on their base hours, or if it's a volunteer. I've got a lot of people that volunteer in our program, and so you can get that cost per acre and prescribed burning down way low, working through these partnerships and capitalizing on these windows and sharing your resources. And with that, I'm going to conclude my talk. I will tell a quick story about this. This is a fellow named Jack Shipley. He's on the steering committee for the Oregon Prescribed Fire Council, and we burned his land at TREX a couple years ago. And I just love this photo because it shows a way that we can be working with and living with fire well. I think this is how it should be, enjoying yourself with some fire on the ground, rejuvenating your landscape. And with that, I'll take questions.
I love that, Amanda. I love that you ended on that slide with Jack. That's incredible. So yeah, thank you, Amanda, for speaking with us today, and let's open it up for questions. Go ahead and type those into the chat box or into the Q&A box. I loved your positive perspective on all these different things, whether it was, your perspective with climate change, let's couple that with partnerships and add more prescribed fire. I love that outlook. So I appreciate you talking to us today about expecting the unexpected.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So I'll just give it a minute here or so for some questions. And while we're waiting, I just want to say that the consortium offers a diversity of opportunities for people to participate in, and hosting webinars like today is just one way we accomplish that. If you'd like to learn about other opportunities, I do encourage you to go to our website. Some things we're looking forward to for future in 2020 and 21 are holding West Side Symposia, communications workshop, some field tours with a sustainable Northwest, and various other things. We also have a lot of different resources from our research briefs, our syntheses. We have a great syntheses out on suppression cost and fire facts, various things like that. So, go ahead and check those out. Okay, I do have a question here. Let me see if I can raise my bar here a little bit to completely read it. How prevalent is plastic PE covers in prescribed fire activities in Oregon and Washington?
Great question. I can't really speak to Washington quite so much, but I know in Oregon it's fairly prevalent. PE is polyethylene, and it's sheeting that is used to cover fuels in piles so that when they're burned, they're dry and available. There was a study that the EPA did here in Oregon a few years ago to quantify emissions from covered and uncovered piles. So what they did was they had literally a hot air balloon tethered to a couple of ATVs that they had locked down, and they had an air quality monitor that was hung below this hot air balloon, and that suspended it above piles that were burning so that they could establish and evaluate the emissions from piles that were covered versus uncovered. And they found that piles that were covered had far less emissions than piles that were uncovered. And the reason for that is there's incomplete combustion. So the incomplete combustion from those wet piles actually produces more emissions and pollution than piles that are covered. I would imagine that the PE is going to increase because of the fact that the expansion of the size was passed in the Oregon Smoke Management Plan revision this year. And so we'll probably see more of that in the future. But I would say it's more common than not. The one thing to remember is that plastic sheeting is very expensive. And so you're not going to see people use more of it than they have to. Some people actually go to the trouble of removing it before they burn the pile so they can reuse it. So not all of it actually gets burned, but I would say it's more common than not.
Okay. Amanda, how do you propose small private landowners address prescribed burn regulation and often burdensome resource requirements set forth by the state agencies that govern fire? For instance, the Washington I think they meant Washington DNR in Washington will make a landowner have several dozers, a 20-man crew, etc.
Yeah, that is a huge issue that and I'm not sure what's happening in Washington quite as much as what's happening in Oregon, but I know that Oregon Department of Forestry and working with both the Good Neighbor Authority and the state and private forestry grants are looking to basically incorporate private lands into some of our larger landscape cross-boundary burns to take some of that burden off landowners, because those requirements are generally more than what a landowner can afford. So like this picture of Jack here, he's not flush with money and necessarily going to be able to afford that $10,000 or whatever it might cost to implement a prescribed burn on his property. So we use the TREX program as an opportunity to train while we also help him get his burning done. A small contribution from the landowner in the form of paying for a burn plan to be written sweetens the deal quite a bit. But I would say that that what I see in the future as something that could really work well is the formation of prescribed burn associations. They've done this down in Humboldt County in California. They're very common in the Great Plains and in southeastern United States. And what they do is they basically bring together folks who have different resources and contributions to help burn together. And so when they can assemble, if 20 people need to be there, it doesn't mean a 20-person hand crew needs to be there necessarily. Maybe it just needs to be 20 trained firefighters, right? And so the formation of prescribed burn associations, I think, is another thing. And I think just getting involved in the Prescribed Fire Council and telling the folks in the council that that's what you want to work on and becoming involved will give you a venue to help deal with that, because it's a real limitation, and it's something that will only keep us from getting more good fire on the ground in the future.
That's great. And somebody adds the comment that Washington is also updating its permitting process to streamline conditioning permits and look at making changes on other related issues.
Oh, great.
So, yeah, I just want to step back for a second. A couple of folks have put in some comments about the PE, and somebody says Washington doesn't use PE because it's illegal. The law needs to be rewritten on that.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I didn't either. They've been, as I understand, they've been working on changes to their smoke management plan, and my hope would be that they would take that study that the EPA did here in Oregon and apply that up there, because it really does make a difference.
Yeah, somebody said it used to be illegal here in Oregon too until we changed it. So
that's right.
And then just to add on that, those covered piles burn quicker, less lingering smoke, which I think you did cover, Amanda.
Yep.
So how does the councils or groups set or help set the priorities?
Sorry, what was that now?
So how do the prescribed fire councils or those groups set or help set priorities?
That's a good question. If it's a prescribed burn association, it's usually a local group. So the one in Humboldt County is literally just in that county. And so they come together and they set their priorities as a group. They self-organize. I know of one in Nebraska where there's kind of a lineage involved where if you want your land burned, you have to participate in helping some other landowners burn first, and then they'll come over to your property and help you get your burning done. So it's almost like a mini landowner exchange, with some training involved, but really the objective of treating their land. So those private landowner cooperatives are really the way to go, and it's something we need to get going here in the Pacific Northwest. And the Humboldt County one is the first one on the West Coast. Okay.
I'm not sure you covered this, but in case you didn't, somebody was talking about your answer for the PE and said, great answer, but does the inclusion of PE on landscape-sized prescribed fire going to require NEPA documentation?
That's a good question. I'm not sure whether that is covered. I think it's probably addressed somewhere in NEPA, but I think that it would probably default back to the existing knowledge base. That I know that it's in there, but there's been in the past there's been a limitation of a 10 by 10 size, I believe, and depending on the size of the pile, that may or may not be adequate. But that's a good question. I'm not sure I can really answer that adequately.
Okay. Another question here, are there training opportunities for students beyond TREX?
Oh, that's a good question. Let's see. Well, I guess if you're talking about training opportunities that are outside of employment, so you can be employed by the federal government, for example, or you can be employed by a state agency, and then you get training that way. You can, if you want to, volunteer with the Nature Conservancy. Really, we prefer people go through the TREX program, but in some cases we'll sponsor volunteers who are working with other entities like watershed councils, who can basically sponsor people, or we sponsor them and they're employed by the watershed council, and that's a way for us to partner more adequately. I think that there's a need for more opening of doors. The Prescribed Fire Training Center in the Southeast in Florida is a great opportunity, but if you don't have an incident qualification card, you can't go. So I feel like that's not necessarily a great opportunity for students. The University of Idaho has a pretty good program. There's a couple of different universities that have programs where students can get training and opportunities, but then they usually end up going to TREX. I think TREX is really a program that we're pushing as a way for students to get more experience, and the SAFE councils have been sending their folks to our TREX events for that reason.
Okay, great. Well, I just want to say overall here, I'm getting a lot of comments through the question and answer that are saying great webinar. This has been really great. So I wanted to push that off to you, Amanda, that this was in fact a really great webinar. And just a comment that somebody said that the spiral animation of temperature increasing over centuries packs far more punch than the usual bar graph, so thanks for that.
Oh yeah, that's great.
So we have run out of time, unfortunately, so I want to respect your time and thank Amanda again for speaking with us today. I want to thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to listen in today. There is a short survey at the end of this webinar that I encourage you to take. That information you provide us helps us to measure the impact from this webinar, as well as it offers opportunities for you to leave comments or tell us what you want to see in the future for webinars. So please go ahead and take that survey. And just again, thank you so much, Amanda, for your time and your awesome webinar today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.
You too. Bye, everyone.